Hello and welcome back. Whether you're here for the first time or you've settled in with us before, I'm really glad you're here tonight. I'm Mr. Dantello, and we've got something special waiting for you as you wind down. Tonight, we're exploring ghosts and haunted places. Those stories where the boundary between past and present grows thin, where homes hold memories that refuse to fade. These are the kinds of tales that sit with you, that make you think twice about the spaces around you. We have 3 stories lined up. First, we're visiting the attic that holds more years than the house has existed, a place where time doesn't quite add up. Then we'll move into the previous owner's routine still happens when I'm asleep. The unsettling reality of sharing your home with an echo of someone else's life. And finally, we'll examine I keep finding photographs of myself in rooms I've never entered, a mystery that blurs the line between the familiar and the impossible. If you've been enjoying the channel, a like or subscribe means the world to us and helps others find their way here too. Now, get yourself comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Settle into bed. Let your shoulders relax. This is your space to unwind. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Let's start with our first story. Story 1. The attic that holds more years than the house has existed. The latter doesn't quite fit the opening anymore, though I'm sure it did once. I noticed that first on a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks after I'd moved into the house. The attic access is a pull-down ladder mounted in the hallway closet on the 2nd floor, the kind that telescopes down with a metal mechanism that's probably original to 1952, when the house was built. The opening in the ceiling had been sealed with thick particle board at some point, painted over so many times the original color was just a memory beneath the cream and eggshell. When I yanked the cord to lower it, the ladder descended with a shriek of hinges that hadn't seen oil in decades, and it hung there in the hallway like a mechanical throat, open and waiting. The thing was, the particle board had to have been removed recently. Not recently by me, I'd only just arrived. Inheritance papers still in a folder on the kitchen counter. My clothes still in suitcases, because hanging them felt like admitting I was staying. But someone had opened this space. The wood around the frame was lighter where the seal had been broken, raw and splintered at the edges. I didn't climb up that first day. I just stood there in the hallway, hand on the bottom rung, listening to the quiet of the house. It was the kind of quiet that only old houses have, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had learned not to make noise. The house was settling, I told myself. Houses settle. That's what they do. The farm itself sits on 30 acres about 4 miles outside of town. The nearest neighbor is the Hendersons, though I've only seen Mrs. Henderson once, waving from her yard at a distance too great for a wave to feel like anything but a strange gesture. The house belonged to my great-aunt Sarah, a woman I never met. The estate lawyer who handled everything said she'd lived alone here for the last 20 years of her life, that she was reclusive, that the house had been left to me because I was the last person on a very short branch of a very old family tree. No other takers. No one else wanted it. I wanted it. At 32, I'd been working contract positions, living in places that felt like they were being borrowed by someone else. I'd been moving toward something for years without knowing what it was. When I read the description of the property, the original structure from 1952, brick exterior, mature oaks, needs renovation, it felt like an answer. It felt like the place where I might finally stop moving. The exterior was worse than the listing photos suggested. The mortar between the bricks had given up in places. Dark stains crawled up the north side where water had been seeping in for years. Inside, the rooms had the smell of old paper and dust and something like mouse droppings, though I never found evidence of mice. Just the smell. The appliances in the kitchen belonged to an era when people believed in harvest gold and avocado, and the carpeting throughout the house was the color of wet sand, worn thin in doorways and hallways. But the bones were good. Real hardwood under the carpet. Plaster walls that were solid except where someone had patched them badly. The kind of place that was waiting to be restored, waiting for someone with patience and time. I hadn't planned to go into the attic at all that first week. I was making a list of things to address: the roof, the foundation, the plumbing. The attic was the lowest priority, the space I figured I'd get to eventually, once the more urgent problems had been addressed. But on that Tuesday, moving boxes into the front room to sort through them, Sarah's things, mostly which the estate had been storing, I found a small key taped to the inside of a decorative box. Nothing identifying, just a tarnished brass key, maybe 2 inches long, with a decorative head shaped like a flower. I took it upstairs. The key didn't fit any lock on the second floor. Not the bedroom doors, not the bathroom cabinet, not the small secretary desk in the corner of what had been Sarah's room. I found myself standing in the hallway, holding this small piece of metal, knowing it meant something, knowing someone had wanted it preserved. That's when I decided to look in the attic. The ladder came down harder the second time, like it was resisting. Once it was fully extended, I could see up into the opening, a dark square of space, insulation visible at the edges, a thickness of years. I turned on my phone's flashlight and climbed. The attic was exactly what I expected. Wooden beams running the length of the house, the underside of the roof sheathing, insulation that had gone the color of old bone, boxes and stacks in shapes I couldn't quite identify in that first sweep of light. The air was still and cold in a way that felt separate from the temperature of the house below. There was the smell of dust and wood, and something organic that I assumed was age itself. The circular window on the north side was the only source of real light, and it faced the woods. The glass was filmed with dust, the frame was wooden, painted white so long ago the paint had yellowed to cream. Very little light made it through. I stood there for a while, letting my eyes adjust. letting the space become less like a photograph and more like an actual room. The beams cast long shadows. There were maybe a dozen large boxes stacked against the far wall, all of them soft with age, water stains on one. A rolled carpet leaning in the corner, bound with twine that had rusted into disintegration. A small wooden chair with 3 legs tipped onto its side. And there, wedged between 2 of the thickest beams near where the roof sloped lowest, something that caught the light from my phone in a way that suggested leather. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps muffled by the insulation. The boards beneath my feet were solid old wood, the kind of material that would probably outlast the whole house if given the chance. The item between the beams was a journal, or something that had once been a journal. The leather cover was dark and cracked, the pages swollen and yellowed. The spine had faded to a color that might have once been burgundy. I reached for it carefully, half expecting it to disintegrate. It didn't. The leather was surprisingly intact, though it was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. The moment I held it, I knew the house was a different kind of problem than a roof and a foundation. The moment I felt the weight of it, the accumulated days of someone else's life bound in paper and leather, I understood that Sarah hadn't left this house to me because she had no one else. She'd left it to me because someone had to come back. Someone had to read what was inside. I opened the cover carefully. The first page bore a date in careful handwriting, the kind that belonged to a different century, 1887. Below that, a single sentence: "We have moved into this new house, and I intend to keep an account of all that transpires within it." The handwriting was steady and clear. The ink had faded to brown. But as I stood there in the attic of a house that had been built in 1952, holding a journal that claimed to be from 1887, something very specific became clear to me. I was not the first person to have read this. I was not the first person to have noticed the impossibility. And I was very certainly not the first person to have stood in this attic, holding proof that the house was older than the house itself could possibly be. I closed the journal slowly and climbed back down the ladder. For the rest of that day, I did not return to the attic. I told myself it was a mistake, that I'd misread the date, that there was a rational explanation, a misdated journal, something that belonged to a different property, some confusion in the estate holdings. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd read the handwriting clearly. The date was explicit. That night, I sat in Sarah's kitchen, made tea that tasted like dust no matter how fresh the water was, and I thought about inheritance, about what it really means when someone leaves you their house, about whether it's possible for a place to hold more history than the structure itself should contain. The attic settled above me with small creaks and shifts, the sounds of old wood moving in the cold. I didn't sleep well. The next morning I made a decision. I would approach this rationally. I would catalog everything in the attic, document it properly, and find the explanation that had to exist somewhere in the accumulated details of Sarah's life and property history. It seemed like a plan that would make sense. Plans are comforting that way. I climbed back up with a notebook and a flashlight, determined the attic was different in daylight, less oppressive. Though the air still felt thick, undisturbed, I started with the obvious, the journal itself. I photographed the cover, the date, the handwriting. I checked for any indication that it might be a reproduction, a novelty, something printed to look old. The paper was genuine. The binding was genuine. The wear patterns on the leather suggested decades, more than decades, of handling. I opened it again and began to read, this time more carefully. The first entry described the move into the house. The language was formal, almost stilted. The furniture has been arranged according to Margaret's preferences. The house is situated on pleasant ground, with good southern exposure and adequate outbuildings. The previous residents departed hastily. We have found several items left behind in the cellar, which I shall have removed. No mention of what those items were. The entries continued in similar fashion, day-to-day accounts of domestic life, the establishment of routines, the hiring of household help. The writer's name appeared to be James. His observations were precise and detached, more ledger than memoir. But as I read further, perhaps 20 pages in, the tone began to shift. There is something peculiar about the master bedroom. The temperature is notably cooler, particularly near the northern wall. Margaret has commented upon it twice. I have examined the exterior stonework and found no obvious source of draft. The cold persists regardless of season. 3 pages later, Margaret will not sleep in the bedroom. She has moved her things to the guest chamber. I cannot persuade her otherwise, though she refuses to articulate her specific objection. She says only that the room remembers. I find this fanciful. A room cannot remember anything. I sat back, the journal heavy in my lap. This was written in 1887, or claimed to be. Sarah had owned this house for 15 years before she died. Surely she had read this. Surely she had known what it contained. I continued reading, and with each entry the unease deepened. James documented increasingly strange occurrences, doors that would not remain locked, water from the eastern tap that came out dark. Though Margaret insisted, it was clear the moment before she looked at it. Sounds in the walls, James was careful to note that these could be rodents, settling wood, any number of mundane causes, and yet the frequency of his mentions suggested he was trying to convince himself. There was a gap in the entries. Entire pages had been removed. I could see the torn edges where they'd been cut out, deliberate and methodical. When the entries resumed, the handwriting had changed. It was shakier, less measured, and the content had shifted entirely. I cannot continue to document what transpires here. I have made the decision to burn certain pages. Some knowledge is not meant to be preserved. Some occurrences are not meant to be explained. We will remain in this house because we have nowhere else to go, but I will write no more about what happens within these walls. Let the next resident make their own discoveries. Let them form their own conclusions. I wash my hands of this account. That was the final entry. The rest of the journal was blank. I sat in the attic light holding a document that raised more questions than it answered, and I realized something with sharp clarity. Sarah had known exactly what she was giving me. This wasn't an accidental inheritance. This was a burden passed down deliberately. This was a house asking for a witness. I climbed down from the attic unsettled but not yet afraid. Fear hadn't found its footing yet. That changed the same evening. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something simple, pasta and vegetables, when the tap that James had mentioned in his journal began to run. I hadn't touched it. I was across the room, completely focused on chopping an onion. But the cold water started flowing, just slightly. Not enough to splash, but enough to be unmistakable. I turned it off. The handle was warm. I opened every cabinet under the sink, checking the pipes, looking for any sign of deterioration or automatic function. Everything appeared normal. The pipes were solid, showed no sign of leaks. There was no mechanism that would cause the tap to activate on its own. I told myself it had been running already, that I'd simply not noticed. I was tired. The house was old, and old houses did strange things. Pipes expanded and contracted, water pressure fluctuated. This was nothing. But I found myself avoiding that tap for the rest of the evening. The next occurrence happened 2 days later. I'd moved into what had been Sarah's bedroom, the guest chamber where Margaret had retreated in 1887. It was the most practical choice. The master bedroom felt wrong to me in a way I couldn't articulate. I'd walked into it once, only once, and the air inside had seemed too heavy, too conscious of my presence. I was sitting on the bed reading when I noticed the cold spot. It was near the northern wall, exactly where James had documented the temperature anomaly all those years ago. It was a circle of cold, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, and the air within it was noticeably colder than the rest of the room. Not a draft, not a window problem, just cold, a pocket of it, concentrated and deliberate. I put my hand into it and then immediately removed it. The sensation was wrong, not painfully cold, but too distinct, too present. It felt like something was maintaining that temperature intentionally. I moved the reading lamp closer and examined the wall. There was nothing unusual about it. No cracks, no discoloration, no visible source for the phenomenon. I checked behind the furniture, looking for a vent, an opening, anything. There was nothing. I left the bedroom and didn't return to it that night. I slept downstairs on the couch, telling myself it was more practical, that I needed to better understand the layout of the house, any number of justifications that amounted to the same thing. I was afraid, and I didn't yet want to admit it. The journal remained on the kitchen table. I'd brought it down from the attic, unable to leave it isolated in that space, though I couldn't have explained why I felt that way. It seemed important to keep it close, as if it might provide answers. I began reading it again, more systematically this time, trying to extract meaning from the gaps and silences. What had James burned? What had Margaret seen in that bedroom that convinced her it would not allow her to sleep? The journal wouldn't tell me. James had been too careful in his silence. But there were other clues, subtle ones. references to a previous resident who had departed hastily, the curious detail that the cellar had contained items the new owners needed to have removed, the fact that James's final entry suggested that whatever was happening had become too significant to document, as if writing about it made it worse, gave it more substance, more permanence. By the fourth day in the house, things had become more frequent. The cold spot had expanded. It now occupied most of the master bedroom, making the room genuinely inhabitable. I confirmed this when I forced myself to go back, to gather a few items I'd left behind. The moment I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath after only a few seconds. It was July. The house had no air conditioning, and the day outside was warm. The water continued its intermittent behavior. Not just the eastern tap now, sometimes the upstairs bathroom sink would run for several minutes before stopping of its own accord. Sometimes the kitchen water would come out with a faint discoloration, exactly as Margaret had described, though it always ran clear the moment I looked directly at it. And then there were the sounds. They started in the walls at night, not the familiar creaks and groans of an old house settling, but something more deliberate. Movement, deliberate movement, as if something was traveling through the spaces between the walls, making a specific effort to be heard. The sounds would start in one room and travel to another, a progression that suggested intentional traversal rather than random settling. I found myself lying awake, listening to these sounds, mapping their progress through the house's interior, trying to determine if there was any pattern I could identify. There wasn't one. The sounds came randomly, sometimes near my location, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to circle the house entirely. On the seventh night, I heard something that finally pierced through my rationalization. It was a voice. I was in the kitchen reading by lamplight, trying to ignore the sounds in the walls, when I heard it clearly, a woman's voice, muffled but undeniable, coming from somewhere inside the house. It sounded almost like Margaret. Not because I knew Margaret's voice, but because the sound had the quality of someone speaking from very far away, or through very thick walls, and the words were almost but not quite intelligible. I stood very still, my book forgotten. I listened for several minutes, but the voice didn't repeat. The sound faded back into the ambient silence of the house. I picked up the journal with shaking hands and reread James's final entry. Let the next resident make their own discoveries. I was making them. They were beginning to form a pattern, and the pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence or rational mechanical failure. The house was showing me what it had shown James, what had driven him to burn pages and abandon documentation, what had frightened Sarah enough that she couldn't simply sell it or demolish it, but instead had to pass it on to someone she felt could bear witness. The question that kept me awake that night, the one I couldn't suppress or rationalize, was simple and terrible. What happened here that was so significant it refuses to remain in the past? And what was it trying to tell me by making itself known. The journal became my obsession. I read through it methodically, multiple times, filling in gaps with what I was experiencing directly. James's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, not frantic, but compressed, as if he was trying to write faster than his hand could move. The later pages contained fragments, sometimes only a sentence or two before a long gap, sometimes just dates with nothing beside them. August 14th, the attic. August 16th, objects moving position. Certain now. August 19th, Margaret knew. She knew about the attic. That was the entry that stopped me. I sat with it for a long time, reading the words repeatedly, trying to understand what knowledge Margaret could have possessed that would matter now, decades after her death. What would she have known about an attic that would be relevant to whatever was happening inside these walls? I'd been avoiding the attic. I'm not sure when I became aware of that avoidance, but it crystallized one morning while I was in the hallway outside my bedroom, staring up at the attic access panel in the ceiling. I'd walked past it hundreds of times since arriving. I'd never once considered going up there. The thought of climbing that ladder, pushing through that panel, entering that space, it created a specific resistance in my mind. Not fear exactly. Dread was more accurate. The kind of instinctive caution that keeps you from touching something you know is wrong, even without being told it's dangerous. The sounds in the walls had been increasing in frequency. Some nights they barely stopped at all, just continuous, soft movement, back and forth, as if something was pacing behind the plaster. Other nights there were silences so complete they felt like held breath. The water continued its strange behaviors. The cold spot in the master bedroom had begun to emit a faint smell, not decay exactly, but something stale and wrongly preserved, like air that hadn't been changed in decades and had taken on a quality that no longer matched the normal world. I began to spend more time in the library, surrounded by books, avoiding the upstairs entirely. I told myself this was practical. I could read the journal during the day when light came through the windows, when the house felt more like an ordinary place. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what might happen if I went upstairs at night. Not afraid of danger. Afraid of understanding. On the 8th night, I heard the sounds differently. They weren't traveling through random walls anymore. They were moving with purpose toward the attic. I stood in the hallway, listening to the progression behind the eastern wall, then the central beam, then upward, a deliberate ascending motion that ended with a soft impact against the ceiling right at the access panel. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the library with every lamp on, the journal open in front of me, trying to decode James's fragmentary final weeks. There was a pattern emerging, though not one I wanted to acknowledge. The entries grew closer together in time. August 14th to August 16th, 2 days. August 16th to August 19th, 3 days. August 19th to August 21st, 2 days. And then August 21st through August 28th, nothing. A full week of silence in the journal. No entries. No fragments, no dates. The last entry, dated August 29th, took up most of a page, but the writing was so compressed, the words so tightly bunched together, that it was nearly illegible. It knows I know. The attic holds more than years. It holds the thing that refuses to leave. Sarah said not to go up there, but I have to understand what Margaret discovered, what made her certain, what made her stay despite everything. I think she went into the attic. I think that's where the answers are, but I can't. I won't. I cannot bring myself to climb that ladder. Something is preventing me. Not external force. Internal certainty. Deep knowledge that some doors should not be opened by the living. But the sounds are closer now. They're in the walls beside my bed. They're learning where I sleep. If I don't go up there, if I don't find what Margaret found, I don't know what will come down. And that was where the entries ended. I set the journal down with careful deliberation and looked at the clock. 3:47 a.m. I was alone in the house. I had been alone for 8 days. I'd made no phone calls, no contact with the outside world. Sarah's voice had faded to something distant and almost theoretical. The sounds began again at 4:15 a.m. They were louder than they'd ever been, not frantic but insistent, and unmistakably originating from the attic space itself. Dragging sounds, objects being moved, and underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, that voice again, the one I'd heard in the kitchen, but this time clearer, more urgent. Definitely a woman, and definitely speaking words I almost understood. I found myself moving toward the hallway, not consciously deciding to move, but finding my body in motion as if following a decision my mind had already made. The attic ladder was stowed against the wall, and my hands reached for it automatically. The metal was cold. Not unusual cold, house cold, but it seemed to carry a specific quality, as if whatever temperature had created that dead zone in the master bedroom had extended itself through the physical structure of the building. I hooked the ladder into the ceiling panel. It caught easily, too easily, as if it had been used recently, as if someone had left it in position to be deployed again. The sounds from above grew frantic. I don't remember climbing. I remember the ladder against my hands and the darkness above the panel, and then I was pushing through, my head breaking into the attic space, cold air rushing down around me. And the smell, the wrong preserved air I'd noticed before, intensified immediately, so potent I nearly choked. I pulled myself up and into the attic. My eyes adjusted slowly. There was enough moonlight through a small window at the far end to make out shapes. Boxes, many of them, stacked haphazardly, some of them visibly old, their cardboard soft and discolored with age. And between the boxes, on the dust-covered floor, footprints, recent footprints, multiple sets, overlapping, creating a confused pattern of traffic through the cramped space. But there were no people here. The sounds had stopped the moment I entered. The silence that replaced them was somehow worse than the noise. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, present in this space with me, but not visible. I held very still, barely breathing, trying to make sense of the evidence in front of me. The footprints were fresh, days fresh at most. But I was the only person in this house. I moved forward carefully, my hands touching the exposed beamwork of the roof, and that's when I felt it. A shift in the air. A movement that wasn't wind. Something passing very close to me. Close enough that the temperature dropped instantaneously in a small, localized area. I spun around but saw nothing. The footprints remained exactly as they were. Impossible evidence of movement I was witnessing in real time but couldn't see. One of the boxes nearest to me toppled. It fell backward, its contents spilling across the attic floor with a sound like dry paper settling. I dropped to my knees and looked at what had fallen. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to the same name. Margaret. I picked one up with trembling fingers. The envelope was yellowed, the postmark dated 1952. The handwriting on the outside was precise and careful, the kind of writing that had learned formality in a different era. But it was the address that caught my complete attention, this house. The same address, not Margaret's address, but an address for Margaret. In this house, in a year that would have made her contemporary with James. Impossible timeline alignment that made no sense. Contradicted everything about what I'd understood about the house's history. I opened the letter despite knowing I shouldn't. The message inside was brief, written in the same careful hand. Margaret, I received word. The thing in the attic knows you're aware of it. You must be more careful. You must not acknowledge it directly. Once it knows you see it, it begins to act with purpose. I am trying to discover what holds it here, but I fear your own presence in the house may be drawing its attention away from the original cause of its remaining. Please respond. I am very concerned. It was signed with initials I didn't recognize, C.W. I was still holding the letter when the attic went completely dark. Not dark from the moon setting, moonlight suddenly seemed to come from nowhere, to be swallowed by something. The small window at the far end of the attic vanished from my perception. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The footprints on the floor began to move. I couldn't see them moving, but I could hear the soft scraping of shoe against dust, the whisper of clothing, the sound of something dragging its weight across the wooden floor toward my position. And underneath it all, barely audible but absolutely unmistakable, breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like someone who had been running, or someone straining against great physical effort. I backed away from the sound, my hand finding the beam structure again, and that's when my fingers touched something that wasn't wood or dust. It was fabric. Cold fabric. And beneath it, something that had the consistency of, I jerked my hand back, suddenly understanding where I was and what I had nearly touched. The breathing continued toward me. The sounds of movement became more aggressive. I turned and moved toward where I thought the attic opening was, my hands in front of me, feeling for the ladder, finding only darkness in the shapes of boxes. And then something touched the back of my neck, cold, deliberate contact, unmistakably a hand, and I was falling, tumbling through darkness, through the opening, striking the ladder, feeling it collapse beneath me as I fell to the hallway floor below. I lay there, gasping, my vision slowly returning as the moonlight from the hallway windows reasserted itself. Above me, the attic opening gaped like an open mouth. The ladder remained on the ground beside me. Undamaged, the sounds in the walls continued, but they were different now. They were no longer sounds of something trying to communicate from a distance. They were sounds of something that had made contact, something that had touched me, something that knew exactly where I was. And in the silence between those sounds, I could hear, very faintly, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, descending from the second floor toward the first. Footsteps that did not belong to any living person in this house. I don't remember walking to the kitchen. I have a memory of being on the hallway floor, and then I have a memory of standing at the sink with cold water running over my hands and wrists, but the transition between those two moments is gone. Missing a gap in the sequence of my own experience, which seemed to me in that moment like a more intimate violation than the touch itself. The water was ice cold. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them under the stream. I kept expecting to see something on my skin, some mark or evidence of contact, but there was nothing. My neck, where the fingers, where something had touched me, felt tender, hypersensitive. I could have been imagining that. I'd been in a state of acute panic. The mind manufactures details in the dark, but I hadn't imagined the footsteps on the stairs. I turned off the water and stood there, dripping, listening. The house had returned to its normal silence. The ordinary silence of an old house settling, boards contracting, the ambient creaks and whispers that I'd spent weeks learning to dismiss as simply the sounds of age and structure. That's what I tried to tell myself as I stood there. The footsteps had stopped at the landing between the second and first floors. I'd heard them clearly, the distinctive creak of the seventh step, which I now knew intimately from my own trips up and down, and then they'd simply ceased. Not stopped by someone reaching their destination. Just stopped. As though whatever had been descending had simply paused mid-transit and decided to remain there. Suspended between floors, waiting, I dried my hands on the kitchen towel and became very aware of how long I'd been away from the bedroom, how far away it was, how many hallways and stairs I would have to navigate to get back there. It was 3:47 in the morning. I forced myself to walk. Not quickly. Quick movements felt like they might attract attention, might be perceived as acknowledgement, but deliberately, as though I had somewhere to be, as though I was moving with purpose rather than fleeing. The kitchen opened into the dining room into the foyer. I didn't look up at the landing as I passed beneath it. The master bedroom door was closed. I had left it open. I was certain of that. I had deliberately left it open so that I could hear the rest of the house, could maintain some sense of connection to the space around me. The principle of not being trapped. I opened the door and closed it behind me, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I was still sitting there when the sun came up. The morning had a quality of unreality to it. Sunlight streamed through the windows with a sort of cheerful indifference to the night that had just passed. Birds were singing. The house looked like a house again, like something ordinary and stable and constrained by the normal laws of physics and time. I hadn't slept. I'd sat there in the growing light and thought about the letters, about the two different time periods documented in the attic, about a woman named Margaret who seemed to have lived in this house twice, in two separate decades, in impossible proximity to herself. I thought about the person, or whatever it was, who had written to her from some corner of knowledge I couldn't access. C.W. Someone who knew about the presence in the house. Someone who seemed to be trying to help her understand it. By the time full light came, I'd made a decision. I was going to call the Historical Society. I was going to find out everything I could about who had lived in this house, and what order, with what overlaps or contradictions in the records. If the attic contained physical evidence of temporal impossibilities, then those impossibilities should have left traces elsewhere, in census records, property transfers, any of the documentation that tracks a human life. I also was not going back into the attic. The local historical society was run by a woman named Sam, who seemed delighted to have someone take an interest in the house beyond the cursory how charming that most new owners offered. She pulled out a file that was thick and disorganized and scattered across several different tables in her small office. The house was built in 1887, she said, pushing her glasses up her nose as she leafed through papers. Originally stood as one of the town's nicer residences. There were two families who occupied it for extended periods and a few shorter-term residents. Let's see. The first family owned it from 1887 to 1932. The Hendersons. Nice people by all accounts. She pulled out a photograph, sepia-toned, showing a family of 6 arranged stiffly in front of the house. The house looked smaller in the photograph, somehow, or maybe that was just the technology of the time making everything look diminished. After that there's a gap. Sam continued, frowning. Looks like the property changed hands several times between 1932 and 1945. I don't have good records for that period. A lot of the documentation from that era is spotty. But then, in 1945, we have another long-term resident. She pulled out another file. Margaret Ashford, Sam said, reading from a property transfer document. Purchased the house in 1945. Lived here until 1961 when she sold it. That's a good long residence. 16 years. During that period, she had some work done on the property. There are records of improvements, renovations. She seems to have taken good care of it. Margaret Ashford, 1945 to 1961. I felt my chest tighten. Do you know anything about her? I asked. Where she came from? Why she left? Sam shook her head. Not much in the records. She doesn't seem to have been particularly involved in the community, no contributions to the town records, no mention in the newspapers that I could find. She was a private person, I think. Why do you ask? I told her about finding the letters in the attic. I showed her the photographs of the objects I'd found. I'd taken pictures before I'd realized what they meant, before the attic had begun to reveal itself as something other than simply an old storage space. Sam looked troubled. Those dates don't match what the property record says. she said carefully. Margaret Ashford purchased the house in 1945, but if you found letters dated to 1928 or references to her living here before that time, she trailed off, not finishing the thought. Well, that would be odd. What if there was another Margaret? I suggested. A previous resident? Sam returned to her files, leafing backward through the property records. The Henderson family had a daughter, she said slowly. Margaret. She would have been living in the house during the 1920s. But she married in 1929 and moved away. Changed her name. I have it here somewhere. She squinted at a document. Margaret Henderson married a man named Ashford, James Ashford. They moved to Boston, I believe. And then he died, I think, during the war, 1944. And then Margaret returned to the town and purchased her childhood home in 1945. She looked up at me. She came back, Sam said. She bought the house she grew up in. That's quite a choice, isn't it? To return to a place you've already left, to repurchase the house where you were a child. I didn't answer her. I was looking at the photograph of the Henderson family, at the girl in the image who would have been Margaret. She was standing in the back row, slightly out of focus, her face caught in three-quarter profile. It was impossible to read her expression. I returned to the house, and I did not go to the attic. Days passed. Then a week. I arranged for a contractor to come assess the water damage in the far corner of the second floor, a problem I'd been ignoring. I cleaned the baseboards. I organized the linens in the hallway closet. I performed the small rituals of habitation and normalcy, and during those rituals, I tried very hard not to think about the attic, or about Margaret Ashford, or about the presence that had touched the back of my neck in the dark. The house, for its part, seemed to have returned to something approaching its baseline strangeness. The sounds in the walls continued, but they were distant, undemanding. The cold spots remained in the same locations. There were no new letters. The footsteps on the stairs did not repeat. But something had changed in the architecture of my experience. There was a knowledge now, a before and after. I could no longer move through the house with the comfortable obliviousness of genuine ignorance. I knew that something here maintained a kind of consciousness, that it was aware of me. That awareness, once established, could not be unestablished. It was in this suspended state of coexistence that I found myself one evening, about 10 days after the incident in the attic, standing in the hallway outside the master bedroom. I wasn't consciously heading anywhere. I'd simply emerged from the kitchen and found myself there, as though my feet had made a decision independent of my rational mind. The hallway was in that in-between state of twilight where the day had not quite surrendered to night. The light coming through the windows was pale and saturated with blue. I heard the footsteps beginning on the landing above, not descending this time, just present, the soft sounds of someone walking across the space at the top of the stairs, from one side to the other, moving with purpose, not searching, not random, simply moving through the space as though they were making a habitual crossing, an ordinary piece of their routine. The footsteps did not come down. They simply ceased. as though the person who had made them had stopped at the edge of the stairs and remained there, listening, or perhaps simply standing in the hallway on the second floor, doing whatever it was they had come to the hallway to do. I thought about Margaret Ashford. I thought about the 16 years she'd spent in this house, repurchasing her childhood home after her husband had died, after she'd been left with the weight of a name that was no longer hers in any meaningful sense. I thought about how much time she must have spent walking these hallways, ascending and descending these stairs, maintaining the rhythms of habitation in a space that was no longer quite the home she remembered. I thought about what it might mean to haunt the place where you'd actually lived, where you'd actually belonged, and how that was perhaps a more complete kind of haunting than the violent or tragic ones. How to be bound to a place not by death, but by the weight of return, the inability to leave again once you'd come back. The footsteps upstairs moved one more time, a brief soft crossing from one side of the landing to the other, and then there was only silence, and the steady darkening of the hallway as the evening deepened around me. I stood there for a long time, not moving, not speaking, simply acknowledging the presence that had become as much a part of the house as the walls themselves. And in that acknowledgment, in that strange and quiet moment of coexistence, there was something that almost resembled a kind of peace. Not comfort, not understanding, but something like acceptance of the fact that some presences never fully leave a place, and some places never fully release the people who return to them. The footsteps did not come again that night, but I began hearing them regularly after that, always at twilight, always on the landing between the floors, always moving with that same deliberate, habitual quality, as though someone was simply continuing with the rhythms they'd established decades ago, indifferent to the fact that the time for those rhythms had long since passed, and I stopped trying to avoid them, stopped trying to convince myself they were the house settling, stopped building elaborate explanations for sounds that needed no explanation. They were simply there, in the way that the cold spots were there, in the way that the shadows at the end of the hallway seemed to linger longer than physics entirely accounted for, in the way that some places carry the weight of their histories not as past but as ongoing, present, unfinished business that would continue long after I had left. And on certain mornings, when the light came through the attic window at a particular angle, I could see the footprints in the dust had been disturbed again, a small set of tracks, leading from the corner where I'd found the letters to the far wall and back again, as though someone had been searching for something, or waiting for something, or simply maintaining the habit of movement in a space that had become the only home they had. Story 2. The previous owner's routine still happens when I'm asleep. The kettle was warm when I touched it, not hot. Warm, that settled heat that lingers for maybe 20 minutes after boiling, the kind you notice because your skin expects cold metal and finds something else instead. I'd made coffee the night before around 9. standing in this kitchen alone like I had every night for the past 6 months, watching the kettle's red light cycle on and off. By morning, it should have been cold. The house was cold. November in this part of the county doesn't forgive. The old radiators clank through the night like something mechanical and exhausted, struggling to push heat through pipes that probably haven't been properly bled since before my parents were born. I set the kettle down on the burner anyway and turned the dial. The kitchen filled with that waiting sound, the faint electric hum beneath everything else. Outside the window, the property spread itself out in shades of gray. 40 acres of it, most of it woods now, all of it mine in ways I was still learning to understand. The house itself is 1890s or thereabouts. A Victorian farmhouse, the realtor had called it, which was generous. It's the kind of place that was probably impressive once, with its steep roof and the wraparound porch that sags slightly on the eastern side. The bones are good, everyone said when I bought it. You could fix it up. It has potential. None of them had made the offer, though. None of them had wanted to stay very long during the showings. I'd grown up 30 miles away, in a town where I knew everyone's parents and half their grandparents. Moving back to the county felt like slipping into a coat that fit differently now, still mine, but altered by time and distance. When my great-aunt left me the house in her will, I'd been working a job I hated for a company that was restructuring itself into obsolescence. The timing felt like something, though I'm careful now about assigning meaning to coincidence. The house felt like a chance to reset, to own something, to be alone in a way that felt intentional rather than circumstantial. The kettle clicked off. I poured the water over the grounds, watching it bloom and darken in the filter. The kitchen was quiet, except for the small sounds of morning ritual, the soft clink of the mug on the counter, the opening of the refrigerator door, the briefness of cold air that spilled out when I reached for milk. These sounds are the ones I've come to rely on. They're evidence. They prove I'm here, that I'm alive in a house that sometimes feels less like a dwelling and more like a held breath. The kitchen itself is a study in contradictions. The original Victorian bones are still visible in the high ceiling with its pressed tin panels, now dinged and stained with watermarks from who knows what. The floorboards are original, too, dark wood that's been worn smooth and pale in the traffic pattern between the door and the ancient cast iron stove. But someone, I assume the previous owners, though I haven't been able to find anyone to ask directly, had installed modern cabinets sometime in the 70s. They're white, vaguely cheap-looking, and they hang above the counters like an afterthought. The countertops are newer still, beige laminate that curls slightly at the seams. Someone had tried to update this space and had done it in layers, never finishing, never committing to a single vision. I'd meant to do something about it, but 6 months had passed, and I hadn't replaced anything. I'd learned instead to move around the contradictions, to let the kitchen be what it was, a collision of decades, a space where nothing quite matched, but somehow it all remained functional. There was something honest about that, I thought. something true. I finished my coffee standing at the counter, looking out the window toward the woods. November had stripped the trees. The branches looked skeletal and precise against the gray sky. Somewhere out there, probably, there were deer bedding down in the laurel thickets. Coyotes, the small, careful animals that live in margins. I'd heard the coyotes twice since moving in, their voices high and strange in the dark, nothing like the dog sounds I'd expected. They sounded like something caught between wild and domestic, between what was supposed to be and what actually was. By the time I put the mug in the sink, the kitchen was warming up from the radiator. The sun, what there was of it on a November morning, had begun its pale climb into the window. Another day in the house. Another night ahead of it. I'd settled into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Work from my study in the morning, inventory the endless projects in the afternoon, attempt to read or watch something in the evenings, sleep as early as I could manage. That's when I should have noticed something was wrong. Not that the kettle was warm. I'd rationalized that easily enough, explaining it to myself as residual heat, as my memory playing tricks, as something unremarkable that my mind had transformed into something noteworthy. But looking back now, the wrongness was already there. It was in how quiet the house was, how still, how it seemed to hold its breath whenever I wasn't actively moving through it. I didn't notice it then. I was still learning the rhythms of the place, still treating it like a space that belonged to someone else, that I was simply staying in temporarily. Still not understanding that old houses aren't neutral. They have weight. They have opinions. They have the accumulated pressure of everyone who ever lived inside them, and sometimes, you can feel that pressure pushing back against you, testing the boundaries of your presence. The first real oddity happened 3 days later. It was a Thursday. I remember because I'd made a point to mark my days since moving in, trying to establish some structure in a life that had become unmoored. Thursday morning, the same as every other morning. The kettle was warm again. This time I stopped and really thought about it. I definitely turned off the burner the previous morning. I always do. It's one of those small consciousnesses you develop living alone, being aware of every potential fire hazard, every way the house could kill you through negligence or oversight. The burner was off. The kettle hadn't been touched since I'd cleaned up after dinner around 8. I felt a small flutter then, the first real hesitation. I set the kettle down and checked the burner more carefully. Cold, the dial was in the off position. I ran my hand over the surface. Nothing. No heat rising through the stove itself. I opened the cabinet beneath, half expecting some kind of explanation, some electrical fault or heating element left on. There was nothing. Just pipes and dust and the particular smell of old kitchens, a blend of something cooked into the wood decades ago and something else, something mineral that I'd never quite been able to place. I made my coffee anyway, fed the curiosity by ignoring it, which is what we do when we're not quite ready to admit that something doesn't fit. I drank standing at the window like always, and by the time I'd finished, the whole thing had been reduced to the category of things that happen sometimes. Things that have reasonable explanations you just haven't found yet. But over the next week, the kettle was warm every single morning. Not sometimes, every morning. Consistently warm, consistently impossible. By the second week of this, I'd started keeping a small notebook in the kitchen. Not because I was trying to document something unusual, I would have resisted that framing, but because I was trying to understand my own habits more clearly. Had I been using the kettle in my sleep somehow? Was I making coffee and forgetting? The notebook would help. Data, evidence, proof of normalcy. The notebook showed what I already knew. Every entry in my own handwriting, every morning accounted for. Coffee at 9, dinner at 6 or 7, television or reading after dark, sleep by 11 when I could manage it, sometimes not until 1 or 2. Never in any of these entries did I write down anything about the kettle. Never a note about making tea at midnight. Never a 3 and boiling of water. But there it was, every morning. Warm, the house settled around me through November like I was becoming part of its structure. I fixed the loose banister on the stairs. I cleared the gutters with my boots balanced on the ladder and my hands full of wet leaves. I learned which floorboards creaked, the third one from the kitchen door, the entire hallway outside my study, the landing on the second floor. I learned which radiators whistled. I learned that the wind sounds different depending on which direction it's coming from, and that there's a particular kind of quiet that happens right before dawn, a silence so complete it seems to have weight. The kettle continued to be warm. I stopped making notes about it. The strangeness of it had begun to feel normal, which is perhaps the worst kind of strangeness, the kind you stop questioning because you've accepted it without ever deciding to. Then came the footsteps. It was a Tuesday, the first week of December. I woke at 3:47 a.m. according to the clock on my nightstand I checked, trying to understand why sleep had abandoned me so abruptly. One moment I was dreaming something indistinct and forgettable. The next I was completely conscious, aware of my own breathing and the weight of the blankets and the particular darkness of a house at that hour. And then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. Not tentative. Not the exploratory steps of someone trying to be quiet. These were deliberate footsteps, purposeful, moving from the direction of the stairs toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, toward the pantry. The sound was distinct enough that I could hear the weight of it, the distribution of steps on the old floorboards. Someone walking, someone in the house. My heart did what a heart does in that situation. It accelerated into something like panic, that animal response that happens before thought. I lay in bed and held my breath and waited for the next thing. The footsteps stopped. I could hear nothing after that. No movement, no explanation. The house had returned to its normal silence, the kind that had become familiar over these 6 months. I sat there in the dark and ran through possibilities. An animal. A very large and very purposeful animal walking on its hind legs. Wind rattling something loose. The house settling. The sounds old places make when no one is paying attention, and then suddenly someone is. By morning, I'd nearly convinced myself, nearly explained it away into the category of dream logic, of sleep-brain confusion where you wake from a nightmare already believing it happened. The mind does that, particularly at 3 in the morning, particularly in a house where you're still learning to trust your own senses. But the footsteps came again the next night. Same time, approximately same pattern, from the stairs, down the hallway, toward the kitchen. Same complete silence after. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay awake in the dark and listened to the house and tried not to think about the particular vulnerability of being alone in a place where you don't know every sound yet, where every creak and shift is still a question rather than an answer. By the following night, I had decided what I would do. I would stay awake. I would wait. I would turn on the hallway light before the footsteps came, and I would see for myself what was making that sound. Fear is better when you have a plan. Fear with a plan is something you can almost manage. At 3:30 a.m., I got out of bed and turned on the hallway light. The sudden brightness was shocking. The hallway, a long, narrow space with doors on either side leading to empty bedrooms, and the narrow staircase at the far end, was completely empty. Dust motes hung in the light from the single bulb. The floorboards stretched out in their familiar pattern. Nothing. No one. Just the house and me and the determined ordinary quality of electric light in the middle of the night. I stood there for 20 minutes, my hand on the light switch, waiting. The cold of the floor seeped up through my socks. Eventually, I went back to bed. The footsteps didn't come that night. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The house returned to its ordinary creaking, the sound of pipes settling, the wind finding its way through gaps in the old window frames. I began to wonder if my decision to wait had somehow changed things. If the presence, I was already thinking of it that way, though I hadn't admitted it aloud, had recognized my challenge and simply withdrawn. But on the 4th night, I found the kitchen faucet running. I discovered it when I went downstairs for water around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep with the weight of too much silence. The tap was turned on full, ice, cold water streaming down into the empty sink, and the basin was dry. It had not been running long. The pipes hadn't warmed yet. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my eyes adjusting to the dark, and watched the water fall before I reached out and turned it off. I had turned it off before bed. I was certain. One of the small rituals of a new space, checking the doors, checking the locks, checking the faucets. A habit from childhood that had never left me. The kitchen faucet came on again the next night. This time I was awake when it happened. I heard it, the particular high-pitched groan of the pipes when the cold water tap is first turned, followed by the soft percussion of water hitting stainless steel. I left the bed immediately and made my way downstairs in the dark. By the time I reached the kitchen, the water was flowing steadily. My hand, when I reached for the tap, was shaking. The metal was warm, not hot. The water hadn't been running long, but warm enough to suggest it had been turned on more recently than my descent downstairs would allow. I turned it off, left my hand on the handle for a moment. The metal was still warm. For the next week, small things began to accumulate. The kind of things that individually might mean nothing but together began to form a pattern that made my shoulders tight and my jaw clench. The living room curtains, always drawn, somehow open by morning. Just one of them, just enough that someone looking from outside would have a view into the room where I spent my evenings. The kitchen cabinet, the one where the glasses lived, found standing open while I slept, and several glasses removed and placed on the counter in a neat row. Not knocked over, not scattered. Arranged, positioned. A door in the hallway that led to the basement, a door I kept locked because the basement was unfinished and damp and held no appeal for me. That door was open one morning. The deadbolt somehow disengaged from the inside. Each occurrence was small. Each could be rationalized individually. Maybe I had opened the curtains and forgotten. Maybe I had gone for a glass of water in the night and lost the memory of it in the fog of interrupted sleep. Maybe the basement door lock was faulty, had never worked properly, had opened on its own from a shift in the building's foundation, or a draft, or one of 100 mundane explanations. But the accumulation of them began to form a picture that my mind didn't want to examine too closely. I started keeping a notebook. I know how that sounds. The thing people do in stories when they're starting to lose perspective. But writing things down, dating them, recording the precise details gave me the illusion of control. If I could document what was happening, it felt less like hallucination and more like investigation. Day 1, faucet on. Water cold, suggesting recent activation. Day 2, curtains open. I always draw these before bed. Day 3, basement door open, lock disengaged. Day 4, kitchen cabinet open. 3 drinking glasses removed and placed in a line on the counter. Day 5, living room. All lights on when I woke, all of them. Ceiling fixture, table lamp, corner lamp. The switches were in the on position. Day 6, nothing. Relief followed by a different kind of dread. Day 7, faucet again. This time the hot water tap. The water was still hot when I came downstairs. By the second week, I had stopped trying to explain it to myself. I had also stopped sleeping well. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from waiting for something to happen, from keeping part of your mind alert even while you're trying to rest. I existed in a state of low-grade vigilance, my dreams fragmentary and anxious. It was during this period that I found the books. The house had come furnished with many things left by the previous owner, Alex. The realtor had told me, though no further details. I had spent my first few weeks going through the pieces of Alex's life that remained. Old magazines, kitchen implements, a closet full of clothes that didn't interest me. But the books had remained mostly untouched, shelved in the study off the main hallway. A small room with north-facing windows and the particular cold that north-facing rooms always carry. I was looking for something to read, something to occupy my mind during the long stretches of the evening, when I was aware I should be tired but couldn't make myself sleep. I pulled a volume at random from the middle shelf, a history of the house, self-published. The kind of thing a previous owner might compile from old newspaper archives and property records. The spine was creased from repeated reading. I opened it randomly and found passages underlined. Not everywhere, not the obsessive marking of a careful reader trying to capture everything, but specific passages given weight by the previous owner's hand. One caught my eye immediately because of the date at the top of the page, 1924. The passage was a newspaper account of a woman who had lived in this house, the exact address was listed, and who had kept a very particular schedule. She would, the account noted, conduct certain household tasks at the same time each evening and again in the early morning hours, before dawn. Cleaning, organizing, small domestic rituals that had been noted by neighbors as unusual because of their consistency and the fact that she seemed to perform them in darkness, apparently without lighting. The passage was underlined 3 times. There was a name, Morgan. The woman's name had been Morgan, and she had lived in the house from 1920 until her disappearance in 1927. The newspaper account did not elaborate on the circumstances of the disappearance. It simply noted that she was no longer present. The house changed owners twice after that before falling into a long period of disuse. I closed the book. My hands felt numb. I put the book back on the shelf and left the study without rereading anything else. I didn't want to know more. But I had already been told what I needed to know. The house had a memory, and that memory was being performed for me night after night, in the slow hours when I was supposed to be sleeping. The footsteps started again that night, but they were different now. They weren't the confused, wandering steps of something that might be an animal or a settling house, or a trick of exhausted perception. They were deliberate. They were the footsteps of someone going about their business, moving through their own familiar space with the confidence of long practice and deep knowledge. I lay in bed and listened to them progress down the stairs, across the hallway, into the kitchen. The faucet turned on. I could hear it from upstairs. The water ran for exactly 3 minutes before it stopped. Then silence, the kind of silence that has presence. And I knew, lying there in the dark, that I was not alone in this house, that I had never been alone, that when I had bought this place, I had bought the routines that came with it, the habits of someone else performed in darkness, repeating themselves with the inevitability of a clock. The question was no longer what was making the sounds. The question was whether it would ever stop, or whether I would be here forever, listening to Morgan's midnight rituals, watching my own life slowly align with the patterns of hers. The book stayed on the shelf for 2 days. I didn't open it again. I told myself I was being rational, that knowledge of Morgan's history had simply primed my mind to interpret ordinary house sounds as something deliberate, something directed. But the rationalization felt thin in the daylight and became transparent by evening. On the third night, I decided to document everything. I set my phone on the nightstand with the voice recorder running, positioned to capture sound from the hallway and stairwell. A simple test. Audio doesn't lie. Audio can't be misinterpreted by an exhausted mind. I would have proof or I would have silence, and either way I could move forward with certainty instead of this creeping dread. I laid in bed for an hour, fully awake, waiting for the sounds to begin. But nothing came. The house settled into a normal quiet, the ambient noise of old wood and aging pipes, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak that belonged to no particular source. I began to relax. Perhaps the ritual had been my imagination after all. Perhaps I was simply a tired person in a creaky house, constructing meaning from randomness the way humans always do. At some point after midnight, exhaustion finally won. I slipped into sleep. I woke to footsteps, but not the footsteps from the stairs. These were different. They were inside the hallway directly outside my bedroom door. The sound of someone moving slowly, deliberately, from the wall near the linen closet toward the far end of the hall. The rhythm was the pattern of someone running their hand along the wall, pausing at certain intervals as if checking for something, or remembering something. My hand reached for the phone before my mind fully engaged. I checked the recording. The timestamp showed the audio had been running for 4 hours. The file size was substantial. I pressed play, expecting to hear only the house settling, perhaps my own breathing or the rustle of sheets. Instead, I heard footsteps, clear, unmistakable, the creak of specific floorboards in the hallway outside my room, the sound of water running in the kitchen below, the precise rhythm of a faucet being turned on and off. The recording captured it all with perfect clarity. And beneath the sounds, so faint I almost missed it, was something else. A sound like breathing, or perhaps the faint brush of fabric moving through air. I listened to the entire recording in the gray light of early morning, sitting rigid on the edge of my bed. The sounds lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then, silence. Then, at the very end of the file, a new sound. The creak of my bedroom door being opened. I hadn't heard it. I had slept through it. I checked the lock immediately. The door was closed, the lock still engaged. But the recording was unmistakable. The slow sound of hinges moving just slightly, just enough to create that particular creak of old brass and wooden frame. The door had been opened while I slept. I sat in my kitchen for the entire day, the phone in my hand. I didn't call anyone. Who would I call? What would I say? I listened to the recording again and again, each time hoping it would sound different, sound more explicable. It never did. By evening, I had made a decision. I would stay awake all night. I would sit in the study, in the dark, and I would wait. I would see whatever was making the sounds, or I would hear nothing. But either way, I would know the truth instead of living in this space between knowing and doubt. At 11:47 p.m., I positioned myself in the study with all the lights off. The darkness was absolute. I had deliberately left the study door open so that I could see into the hallway beyond. I sat in a chair that faced the open doorway and waited. The house settled around me. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat. I could hear the refrigerator shut off downstairs, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I waited. At 1:15 a.m., the footsteps began. This time, there was no question of what I was hearing. They started at the top of the stairs and descended with methodical purpose. Left foot, right foot. The rhythm of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps crossed the hallway at the base of the stairs and moved toward the kitchen. Through the open study door, I could see nothing but darkness and the vague suggestion of the hallway. No shadow passed, no figure materialized. But the footsteps continued, and I heard the cabinet door open, the one where the dishes were kept. Not the kitchen cabinets, the one in the main hallway, the small built-in closet where linens had been stored for decades. The sound of fabric moving, deliberate handling of cloth, the arrangement of something. Then, silence, the footsteps returned, moving back toward the kitchen. The faucet turned on. I could hear it perfectly from where I sat. The water ran, and I waited for the 3 minutes to elapse. But this time, something different happened. The water continued to run. It didn't stop at 3 minutes. It ran for 5, then 7. The sound was steady, uninterrupted, and I sat frozen in my chair, listening to this deviation from pattern, this thing that hadn't happened before, this indication that something had changed. When it finally stopped, there was a sound I had never heard before, a sound like a gasp of air, or a sharp intake of breath, so quiet it might have been imagined. But I knew it wasn't. The footsteps returned to the hallway. They moved toward the study, toward the open door where I sat in absolute darkness. My body went rigid, every muscle locked. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. The footsteps reached the doorway, the threshold of the room where I was sitting invisible in the dark. For a moment that stretched too long, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, no indication of anything beyond the doorway except the presence of it, the weight of something standing just outside the study, in the hallway, perhaps looking into the darkness where I sat. Then the footsteps continued past. They moved back toward the stairs, ascended them in the same methodical rhythm, left foot, right foot, and disappeared into the upper hallway. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I sat in that chair until dawn. I didn't move. I didn't turn on lights. I simply sat and listened to the house settle back into its ordinary creaks and groans. The sound of morning traffic on the street outside, the first light beginning to touch the window. When the sun was fully up, I went to the hallway closet, the one where I'd heard the sound of fabric being handled. The linens inside were arranged differently than I'd ever seen them. The sheets were folded with precision, stacked in a particular order. They formed an organized system, a pattern, a schedule. Someone had been managing them carefully, methodically, with the kind of attention that came from years of practice. I didn't touch them. I closed the door and went back upstairs to my room. That night, I bought a second phone and set up recording in 3 locations: the study, the hallway, and my bedroom. I left all the recording lights visible, a clear indication that I was documenting what happened. The footsteps didn't come. Instead, I heard something else. In the early hours of the morning, while I lay in bed listening intently for any sound, I heard what I can only describe as the sound of pages turning. Slow, deliberate, page after page. It came from downstairs, from the direction of the study. The sound continued for nearly 20 minutes, the careful turning of paper, the whisper of pages being moved one after another through something that felt like a ritual. When I came downstairs in the morning, the history book was open on the desk. I hadn't left it there. I knew I hadn't. The book had been on the middle shelf of the study, precisely where it had been for years, untouched since I'd returned it there days ago. Written by hand, in the margins of the old newspaper clipping, in ink that appeared no newer or older than the underlining around it. The handwriting was careful, methodical, and it read, "She comes back every 7 years. She has to finish what she started. The house remembers. The house keeps the schedule. If you stay, you will learn the schedule. And then you will keep it too." I closed the book carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb something. My hands were shaking. I went back upstairs and packed a single bag. I left the house in the afternoon, locking the door behind me. I've been staying in a rental apartment across town for the past week, and I haven't gone back. But this morning, I received a text message from an unknown number. There were no words in it, just an image. A photograph of my bedroom taken from inside, looking toward the window and the hallway beyond. The image was dated from last night at 2:47 a.m. I was asleep in my apartment when that photograph was taken. I haven't responded to the message. I don't know who sent it or how. I'm still trying to understand what it means, or whether understanding is possible anymore. I only know that the house is still doing what it has always done. It's following its schedule. And now, it seems, it's following me. I stayed in the apartment for 3 weeks before the rental company contacted me about a complaint. The neighbors hadn't reported anything specific, just a general disturbance, they said. Late-night sounds. Movements in my unit when I appeared to be away. I wasn't away. I'd barely left. The apartment was small, modern, aggressively ordinary. No history to it. No previous owners leaving their marks on the walls or in the margins of old books. No schedules written into the foundation. At night, I would lie awake listening for anything. Footsteps, pages turning, the soft sound of photographs being printed downstairs in the dark. Most nights were silent. On the nights that weren't, I convinced myself the sounds came from other units. Neighbors, normal life happening through walls. That's what normal sounded like now. Something I had to talk myself into believing. I called a therapist. I didn't tell her about the house or the handwriting or the photograph of my bedroom. I told her I was having trouble adjusting to a move, that I'd left something important behind, that I was struggling to sleep. She prescribed medication that made everything softer around the edges, less sharp. For a few days, I almost felt normal. The medication made me drowsy in a way that felt close to peace. Then I found the photograph. It was on my kitchen counter one morning, just placed there among the mail I'd collected the previous day. I knew the mail had been sitting on the counter untouched since yesterday afternoon. I was certain of it, and yet there it was, another photograph. This one taken from outside my apartment window, showing my living room, my television, the chair where I'd been sitting the night before. No date on this one, no time stamp. I threw it away in a bag inside another bag in the dumpster outside where I couldn't see it. Then I moved apartments again. The second rental was in an older building, a converted office structure from the 1980s. I chose it specifically because of its newness to residential use. No one's home to haunt it, I thought, with the kind of logic that comes from not sleeping properly for weeks. No routine embedded in the walls, no schedule written across decades. For 6 days, nothing happened. On the 7th night, I found a photograph on my nightstand. I hadn't left it there. It showed my bedroom from the hallway, the door open, my empty bed visible in the darkness. Behind it, impossibly, was a second doorway, one that didn't exist in my apartment. And through that doorway I could see the study of the house I'd left behind. I could see the desk. I could see the history book. I didn't open the photograph to look at it more closely. I put it directly in the garbage disposal and ran the water until I couldn't hear anything else. That afternoon, I called the real estate agency and explained I had a family emergency. I didn't specify what kind. They released me from the lease without question. Perhaps they heard something in my voice, that particular quality of someone who has learned to live partially outside of normal time. I moved back to the house. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was recognition of a fact that had been true all along. I couldn't outrun the schedule. I couldn't move ahead of something that had already mapped out exactly where I would be. So I returned to the space where it had first begun, where Morgan's disappearance had created the first rupture in the orderly progression of days, where the house had learned to keep time differently than the rest of the world. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing had changed in my absence. The study was undisturbed. The history book was back on the shelf. The sheets were still folded with precision in the basement, that careful stack that I've never touched. I moved my bed back upstairs. I started trying to understand the schedule. The footsteps came at irregular intervals, not every night, but following some pattern I couldn't quite perceive. Sometimes weeks would pass in silence. Then for 3 nights in a row, I'd hear them at approximately 3 a.m. moving down the hallway toward the study. The pages would turn. And in the morning, #additional middle section, the house had its own breathing pattern, I'd come to realize. Not metaphorically. The walls seemed to expand and contract with the temperature shifts between day and night. Wood settling in groans that started in the basement and traveled upward like something learning to speak. I'd lie awake listening for it, tracing the path of these sounds through the floorboards above my bed. mapping the invisible architecture of the place like it was a language I needed to decipher. It was the silence between the sounds that unnerved me most. I'd moved into the master bedroom on the second floor, the previous owner's room. The realtor had emphasized this fact with unnecessary pride, as if sleeping where someone else had slept for 30 years was a feature rather than an inevitability. The bed was new. I'd replaced it immediately, but I kept the dresser, a heavy piece of dark wood that had belonged to the house's original built-in, and sometimes I'd notice the drawers were slightly ajar in the morning. Just enough to catch my eye, but not so much that I could convince myself the wood had simply warped. The carpet was the color of old cream, worn pale in a specific path from the door to the window. That path bothered me more than I could articulate. It was the path of routine, of someone walking the same route every morning for years, perhaps decades, until their footsteps wore the fibers thin and the nap of the carpet refused to spring back. I'd tried to reverse it, shampooing that section obsessively, but the path remained. Visible, deliberate at night, my awareness of the space became almost supernatural. I could feel the room's dimensions without opening my eyes, the weight of the ceiling, the particular quality of darkness that pooled in the corners where the lamplight couldn't quite reach. The air itself felt textured up here, grainy like old film. It held the smell of other decades, mothballs and furniture polish, the iron metal scent of something that had once bled into the walls and never quite left, even after paint and primer and fresh drywall. The house's age was palpable at night. During the day, with sunlight cutting across the hardwood and dust motes visible in golden columns, it was just old, but at night it was ancient. The plaster around the ceiling vent bore stains from a leak that had been repaired long before I arrived. Water damage, the inspector had said, pointing at it with professional detachment. But in the dark, those stains looked like fingers, like hands pressed against the ceiling from some space above, leaving marks that wouldn't wash away. I'd taken to sleeping with the door open. This seemed counterintuitive, exposure rather than concealment, but I couldn't stand the feeling of being sealed in a room with something I couldn't see. With the door open, I could hear the hallway. I could hear the stairs. I could construct a map of sound that let me know where everything was, or at least where things were not. The hallway itself was its own atmosphere, 7 feet wide, lined with doors that had once meant something to the people who lived here. I'd counted them at night, lying awake, linen closet, bathroom, guest bedroom, another storage space, the small room that caught the morning light. Each door had a different patina of use. Some were marked with subtle scratches at the frame, a key turned 1,000 times. Others had worn smooth by hands that had rested there for balance. There was one door at the end of the hallway that I'd never opened. The realtor hadn't mentioned it. When I'd asked, she'd looked confused, as if surprised the hallway continued past the guest bedroom. But it did. The door was cream-colored, the same shade as the carpet, which meant it receded into the wall unless you were specifically looking. The knob was loose. I could feel it turn in my hand before I'd ever actually turned it. I hadn't opened it because I was afraid of what confirmation would reveal. As long as it remained closed, I could imagine it was part of the original structure before renovations, sealed and forgotten. Once I opened it, I would have to understand what it led to. I would have to revise my sense of the house's layout. I would have to reckon with the fact that a room I didn't know about existed above the space where I lay sleeping. At night, my heartbeat would drum against the mattress. The bed had a metal frame, sensible, practical, easily cleaned, but it conducted sound and vibration in ways that amplified my own physicality. My body became louder in the dark. My breathing, my pulse, the small shifts of weight as I tried to find a position that felt less exposed. The window beside the bed looked out onto the street, but the curtains were heavy velvet, a rust color that the previous owner had chosen. I'd thought about replacing them, but never had. In the darkness behind those curtains was the sound of occasional traffic, the rustle of the large oak tree that grew in the front yard, the ambient hum of the neighborhood at rest. But sometimes the curtains moved without wind, just slightly. A fold shifting in the heavy fabric as if something on the other side was breathing against the cloth, waiting. I'd place my hand on the mattress where I'd felt the movement earlier. The impression, if there was one, long since cold. The memory of it lingered longer than the physical sensation. Days later, I'd remember something crossed the bed while I slept. Something heavy enough to leave an impression, present enough to steal body heat. And I'd be awake again, reconstructing the night, trying to determine when exactly I'd begun to dream, and when I'd crossed back into waking. That border, that threshold between the two states had become very thin. Sometimes I existed in both simultaneously, aware of the room, the dark, the textures of the pillowcase against my face, but also somewhere else. Somewhere that followed the same path every night, the same path worn pale into the carpet, the same route walked for 30 years before the house became mine. N.G. I'd find new entries written in the margins of old documents, always in that same careful handwriting. Tuesday, the 14th. She was here again. The routine continues. We are part of it now. The house counts differently than you do. Learn to count with the house. I started keeping my own notebook, tracking the sounds, the dates, the pattern of movements. It became a kind of answer to the previous owner's handwriting, my own routine, my own schedule, written into the quiet hours of a house that remembered everything. The photographs stopped coming after I returned. No more images of rooms I was standing in. No more proof that something was watching while I slept. Perhaps it had been confirmation of something, a test to see if I would stay, if I would accept what was happening. Or perhaps the house only needed to reach out when you tried to escape. Once you stopped running, once you settled into the routine, there was no longer a need to send messages. You were already listening. I've been back for 4 months now. The footsteps have become almost familiar. I can distinguish between them more clearly now, can sense which direction they're moving, what they're looking for. Some nights I almost think I could follow them, could walk the same path downstairs and understand what system they're following, what schedule my presence has been incorporated into. I haven't done that yet. Instead, I sit in my room at night with the light off, listening to the house settle and shift around me, learning its rhythms. The previous owner left behind a routine that predates me. The house performs it whether I'm here or not. But now that I'm here, now that I've stopped trying to escape, the routine includes me. It has to. That's how routines work. They continue. They don't require understanding or permission or even consciousness. They simply persist night after night, repeating their movements through rooms and hallways, turning pages in books written by people long dead, accumulating small notations in margins, building their own history in the spaces where no one is supposed to see. Last night, I woke at 3:47 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They passed my bedroom door without stopping. They continued downstairs. I heard the study door open. I heard pages turning, slow, methodical. The sound of a routine that knows exactly what it's doing. And for the first time since returning, I got out of bed. I put on my robe. I went to the top of the stairs and looked down into the darkness of the house below, listening to the sound of pages moving through their familiar sequence. Then I closed my eyes and counted. 1, 2, 3, trying to learn the house's numbers, trying to understand its schedule, trying to fit my own breathing into the rhythm of a routine that has been running since before I was born, that will continue long after I'm no longer here to hear it. 7. The pages kept turning downstairs. I kept counting in the dark. Story 3. I keep finding photographs of myself in rooms I've never entered. The smell hit me first, not unpleasant, but something chemical and settled, like old newsprint stored too long in a damp attic. I stood in the doorway of what had been my great-uncle's master bedroom for the last 43 years, breathing it in, trying to decide if I was actually going to live here. The apartment was mine now. That was the strangest part to say aloud, even silently. Mine, not the kind of inheritance that comes with fanfare or clarity, no will reading, no lawyer's office. Just a letter from the county saying the building had fallen to me as the closest living relative, that I should contact them to arrange probate. The place had been sealed for almost a decade after his death. No one had come to claim it. No one apparently had even tried. I'd driven past it a dozen times before I actually went inside. It was easy to miss, a narrow Victorian squeeze between a laundromat and what looked like an abandoned retail space, the kind of building that made you wonder how it was still standing. 4 stories of dark red brick, white trim gone gray. Windows filmed with the kind of dust that had become sedimentary over years. The front steps sagged slightly in the middle. When I put my weight on the third one, it creaked in a way that suggested a serious conversation with a carpenter was coming. But the interior was better than I expected. Not good, exactly, but better. The master bedroom was on the second floor, the largest room in the apartment. Afternoon light came through two tall windows that looked out onto a neighboring building's blank brick wall. There was furniture, heavy Victorian pieces that looked original, or at least very old. A bed with carved posts and a headboard that rose nearly to the ceiling. A wardrobe. A dresser with a mirror so aged and speckled that looking into it felt like looking back through time, which I suppose was appropriate. I'd been here 3 days now, mostly sleeping on an air mattress I'd brought, trying to get a feel for the place, trying to decide if I could actually stay. That morning, I'd decided to start clearing things out. If I was going to live here, if I needed to move furniture, throw away the accumulated dust and debris of decades, make the space belong to someone from this century. I'd started with the dresser, pulling out drawers thick with lint and finding them mostly empty. Whatever my great-uncle had owned, most of it was gone. What remained was insubstantial. A few coins, a stray cufflink, a receipt from 1987. It was when I was pushing the dresser away from the wall to sweep behind it that I saw the photographs. They'd fallen between the back of the dresser and the wall, a small stack of them, face down. I remember my first thought was something clinical. Water damage? Probably. The building had moisture issues. I could already tell that much. I knelt down and carefully extracted them, expecting them to be stuck together, ruined beyond recognition. They weren't. The first one was clear. A color photograph, Kodak stock, I could tell from the slight yellow cast, showing a room I didn't recognize. Not this one. Somewhere else in the building, maybe, the walls were wallpapered in a pattern of small roses, pale yellow on cream. A single bed stood against one wall, neatly made. And in the photograph, standing in the center of the room, was me. Not me as I was now. I mean, it was my face, unmistakably mine. But the photograph was old, not recent. I could see it in the quality of the print, in the color saturation, in the way the light fell. Maybe 15 years old, maybe 20. I was younger in the photograph, but not young. Mid-30s, maybe, which meant I would have been. I stopped the calculation. It didn't matter. It was obviously a case of mistaken identity. Someone who looked like me, a relative I'd never met, someone I turned the photograph over. On the back in faded pencil were 2 dates, a start date and an end date, both from the previous week. I sat back on my heels. The floor was cold through my jeans. The second photograph showed me in a different room. This one had wallpaper, too, a different pattern, something with thin vertical stripes. I was standing in the same position, hands at my sides, facing the camera directly. My expression was neutral, almost blank. The photograph was dated the same day as the first one, different end time, though, 2 hours later. Same month and year as the first, but scaled in a handwriting that was different. Smaller, thinner, I spread all 5 photographs out on the floor in front of me. In each one I was present. In each one I was standing still, not moving, my face composed and empty. In each one the room was different. In each one I wore the same clothes, dark slacks and a gray shirt that I recognized, something from my own closet, something I owned right now. And the dates on the back were recent, all within the last week, all stamped with times that ranged between 3 and 5 in the morning. I gathered them carefully and stood up, holding them loosely in one hand. My fingers were shaking slightly. I told myself it was the cold. The building was cold. Victorian buildings were always poorly insulated. That was all it was. But I knew where I'd been every night of the last week. I'd been here, in the apartment, mostly in the hallway outside the master bedroom on the second floor, deciding whether I could live in a place that still smelled of my great-uncle's absence. I'd fallen asleep around 11 each night. I'd woken around 7 in the morning. I'd never been unconscious. I'd definitely never been anywhere else. The photographs felt thin in my hand, fragile, like if I thought about them too hard, they might disintegrate. I went back downstairs. The apartment's layout was familiar to me now, more or less. The grand Victorian parlor took up most of the first floor, facing the street. Behind it, a dining room with a table too large for the space. A kitchen from the 1950s or 60s that had never been updated. A small bathroom. Behind that, a hallway that led to the back of the building, and a narrow staircase that went down to the basement. I'd avoided the basement so far. It was the part of the apartment that felt definitively unfriendly. I sat at the dining room table under a light fixture that swayed slightly, as if it had been installed badly and never corrected. I laid the photographs out in front of me in chronological order. 5 photographs. 5 different rooms in this building, rooms I'd never entered. 5 photographic records of me standing perfectly still at times when I was supposedly asleep, supposedly alone, supposedly nowhere at all. The logical explanation was a prank. Someone had photoshopped them, or someone had found very convincing doubles of me and staged these photographs as a joke. But who? I'd only mentioned the inheritance to 3 people, my roommate, my supervisor at work, and my mother. I hadn't even told them where the building was. And besides, Photoshop didn't work like this. Not at this quality. Not with this consistency. The next logical explanation was that I was experiencing some kind of fugue state. I'd read about that in a psychology class once. People who wandered in their sleep, who woke up in places they didn't remember going, who lost hours or even days. But that seemed like something I would have noticed. Surely I would have felt it. The disorientation, the missing time, the physical exhaustion of walking around my apartment at night. I hadn't felt anything. I looked at the photograph on top of the stack again, the room with the yellow wallpaper. Me, standing in the middle of it, my face smooth and empty. When was the last time I'd walked through the entire apartment and actually looked at every room? I couldn't remember. I stood up and left the photographs on the table. I was going to do it now, in daylight, while the building still felt manageable. I was going to walk through every room on every floor, and I was going to look at each one carefully, and I was going to find the room with the yellow rose wallpaper. And when I found it, I was going to understand what was happening. The first floor I already knew. The second floor held the master bedroom, the bathroom, and two other rooms that I'd only glanced into. I opened the first one, a small bedroom with a window looking out onto the narrow space between buildings. The wallpaper here was a dingy cream color, unmarked and peeling in one corner. Not the right room. The second room was larger. Another bedroom, this one arranged as if someone was still living in it. A bed with a chenille spread, still covered in dust but made neatly. Curtains drawn. The air in this room was different, staler somehow, more closed. The wallpaper was a pattern of small gray and blue shapes that might have been meant to evoke something but had faded into near abstraction. Not the right room either. I climbed the stairs to the third floor. The third floor was where the apartment became less apartment-like and more archive. The hallway was longer than it should have been given the building's external dimensions, lined with doors. Some of them were open, some were closed. I counted 7 doors total, which couldn't be right. A standard Victorian apartment building shouldn't have this many rooms on a single floor. The first 2 doors opened onto empty closets, dark and deep. The shelves still lined with yellowed paper. The third door was locked. I tried the handle twice, as if the lock might be broken and just needed the right angle of pressure. It wasn't. It was solidly, definitively locked. I hadn't seen a key to this door anywhere in the apartment, though I hadn't exactly looked. It hadn't occurred to me that there would be locks in my own apartment, doors I couldn't open. I continued down the hallway. The fourth door opened onto a bathroom I hadn't seen before. Old fixtures, a clawfoot tub with stains that no amount of scrubbing would remove, a small window frosted with age. The wallpaper here was water-damaged and peeling, revealing another layer of wallpaper underneath, something older and even more faded. The fifth door was the one I was looking for. The room beyond it was small, narrow, lit by a single window looking out onto the same brick wall as the master bedroom. But the wallpaper was cream-colored with a pattern of small roses, pale yellow. Delicate, they covered every inch of the walls except where they'd faded and peeled near the baseboards. There was a single bed against the far wall neatly made, a small dresser. Otherwise, the room was empty. I stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph again. The composition matched. The angle matched. The light through the window matched, even accounting for different times of day. This was the room. This was where that photograph of me had been taken. I walked the perimeter of the room carefully, as if searching for evidence. For what, I wasn't sure. Footprints? A camera setup? A hidden tripod? But there was nothing. Just the dust and the faded roses and the memory of me, standing here, my face empty and my hands still. I went back downstairs. The photographs were where I'd left them on the dining room table. I picked them up and examined each one again, looking for details I'd missed. In the background of the yellow rose room photograph, I could see the edge of the window frame, the corner of what might have been a dresser. Nothing that suggested how the photograph had been taken, who had been holding the camera, what had been happening in my consciousness at the moment the shutter clicked. Behind me, the apartment settled. Old buildings do this constantly. The wood shifts, The pipes expand and contract. The structure breathes, but I'd never noticed it until now. Now, I noticed everything. The way the light moved across the dining room table, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of traffic from the street, muffled by distance and brick. I put the photographs in a drawer and told myself I would deal with them tomorrow. But I didn't sleep well that night. I lay on the air mattress in the master bedroom and listened to the building. Listened to it settle and shift and breathe. And I wondered, in the dark, whether I was here at all. Whether I had ever actually been here, standing still in those empty rooms, my face empty and my hands still. Whether, right at this moment, someone was taking a photograph. The next morning, I found a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and stared at it. The mug was white ceramic, ordinary, the kind that came with the apartment. Steam rose from it in thin, dissipating threads. The coffee was hot, recently made. The color was right, not too dark, not too light, exactly the way I made it. I hadn't made this coffee. I'd woken late around 9, disoriented from poor sleep. I'd gone directly to the bathroom, then to the living room. I hadn't been in the kitchen. I was certain of this. The apartment was small enough that I would have heard it. The coffee maker's mechanical whir, the sound of water running, the small, distinct clink of the mug being placed on the counter. I stood very still and listened to the apartment. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator ticked in the adjacent room. Outside, the sounds of the street filtered through the walls. Nothing suggested anyone else was here. I picked up the mug carefully, as if it might burn me, though the outside was cool. Someone had made this coffee and left it for me, or made it in my presence without me realizing it, or made it while I was asleep. None of these possibilities had a good explanation. I poured it down the sink. That afternoon, I found the second photograph. It was on the bookshelf in the living room, standing upright against the spine of a book I hadn't opened since moving in. A hardcover with a blue dust jacket, something about history bought years ago and never finished. I found the photograph propped in front of it like a greeting card. This one showed a different room, hardwood floors, a radiator against the wall, the same radiator I could hear ticking in the next room right now. The photograph was taken from inside the apartment. I was certain of it. The proportions of the room matched the proportions of the space I was standing in. In the photograph, I was sitting on the floor with my back against the radiator. My knees were drawn up. My head was bowed slightly, as if I was looking at something in my lap. My face was obscured by my own hair, but the posture was unmistakably mine. The shape of my shoulders, the angle of my spine, the way my hands rested on my knees, these were details only I would recognize about myself. I had no memory of this photograph being taken, no memory of sitting against this radiator, of positioning myself this way, of holding still while something captured me in this moment of apparent stillness, apparent peace. I put the photograph in the same drawer as the first one and closed it firmly, as if the act of closing the drawer could contain whatever was happening. The strangeness accumulated slowly after that. Small things. The kind of things that might have explanations. The apartment's thermostat was set to a temperature I didn't remember choosing. I would adjust it, lower it usually, because I prefer the cold, and the next morning it would be reset to exactly where it had been. A comfortable temperature. Not too warm, not too cold. The temperature someone else might prefer. I found myself standing in rooms without remembering how I'd gotten there. Not blackouts exactly, not the kind of gap that would suggest something medically wrong. More like a skipped frame in a film. I would be in the kitchen, and then I would be in the hallway, and the transition between the two would be absent from my awareness. When I tried to reconstruct the moments, I could remember nothing. It was as if those seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, had been erased. The apartment made sounds I hadn't heard before. Not the sounds of an old building settling. These were different. A rhythmic tapping in the walls, as if someone was gently knocking on the other side of the plaster. The sound would stop when I approached it, and when I pressed my ear against the wall, there was only silence. The silence felt like waiting. I stopped opening the windows. The air outside seemed different. The quality of the light seemed different when I looked through glass that was open versus closed. I couldn't articulate why. It was an instinct, a feeling that something in the building was keeping careful watch on the relationship between the interior and the exterior, and that opening a window was like opening a door that shouldn't be opened. At night, I would lie on the air mattress and listen. The building breathed. It shifted and settled and sighed. And underneath those sounds, beneath them, woven through them, was something else. A presence that occupied the space the way water occupies a container. Not hostile, not threatening, just there. Persistent, aware on. The fourth night, I found the third photograph. This one was in the bathroom. It was standing upright on the toilet tank, propped against the wall where I would see it when I reached for the light. In this photograph, I was standing at the bathroom sink, looking at myself in the mirror. Or I was turned slightly away from the mirror. The angle made it hard to tell. My hands were on the edges of the sink, gripping it. My face was still obscured, turned away from the camera. But my posture suggested I had been standing there for a long time. Standing and looking, or standing and waiting, or standing and listening. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub and held the photograph in both hands. There were now 3 images of me, taken in 3 different rooms of the apartment. 3 moments I had no memory of. 3 pieces of evidence that something was documenting my presence here, capturing me in stillness, in solitude, in apparent absorption with nothing in particular. The terrible part wasn't that these photographs existed. The terrible part was that they felt true. When I looked at them, I recognized something in the posture, the positioning, the quality of stillness. It was as if some part of me, a part I couldn't access consciously, was aware of these moments, as if these photographs were evidence not of something happening to me, but of something that I was participating in without knowing it. I placed the third photograph in the drawer with the others and closed it again. I tried to think of rational explanations. An ex-partner with a key, though I'd changed the locks twice and couldn't imagine why they would do this. A previous tenant who still had access, though the landlord assured me I was the sole occupant. A sophisticated hoax, though I couldn't imagine the purpose or the resources required to maintain it. But underneath all the rational explanations was the growing certainty that none of them were true, that something else was happening in this apartment, something that involved me directly, something that was patient and methodical and persistent. On the fifth night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room with all the lights on and waited for something to happen. Hours passed. The apartment settled around me. The sounds of the street gradually diminished as the night deepened. At some point around 2 a.m, I realized I couldn't remember the last hour. No skipped frame this time, no gap in my memory. I had been awake the entire time. But I couldn't account for the passage of time. It had simply moved forward without me noticing, the way time always does, and suddenly it was 2 a.m. And I was sitting exactly where I'd been sitting before, as if no time had passed at all. In the morning, I found the fourth photograph. This one was on my pillow. The bed I hadn't slept in, the air mattress I used every night, the place where my head would rest when I finally allowed myself to sleep. In this photograph, I was lying down, asleep perhaps, or appearing to sleep. My eyes were closed. My expression was peaceful. My hands were folded on my chest. And the angle of the photograph, the perspective, suggested it had been taken from directly above me, from someone standing over me while I lay defenseless in sleep or in stillness, looking down at me with whatever instrument they used to capture these images. I held the photograph and felt something crack inside me. Not fear, exactly, something deeper. A kind of fracturing of the border between what was happening to me and what I was doing to myself. A blurring of the line between victim and participant. I put the photograph in the drawer with the others and locked it. Then I sat on the kitchen floor and waited for whatever was going to happen next. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to change. Long enough for the apartment to cycle through the sounds of morning, the distant alarm clocks of neighbors, the hum of traffic beginning to build, the peculiar silence that follows dawn in a city that never fully sleeps. My phone was on the counter. At some point, I picked it up and called work. I told them I was sick. I wasn't sure if that was a lie. The drawer was still locked, but I could feel the photographs inside it like a pressure. 4 images of me. 4 moments stolen or captured and this was the thought I kept returning to. 4 moments I'd already lived but couldn't remember living. The distinction mattered. It shouldn't have, but it did. Being photographed without my knowledge was one kind of violation. Being photographed in moments my own mind had discarded was something else entirely. It suggested that something was taking not just my image, but pieces of my consciousness itself. I made tea and let it go cold. Around noon, I decided to look at the apartment differently, not as a place where I lived, but as a space I was trying to understand. I moved through each room slowly, examining surfaces, looking for anything that might suggest how someone else could access these spaces, or how they could take photographs without being seen. The windows were secure. The locks hadn't been tampered with. The walls were solid. There were no hidden cameras. I knew what to look for. I'd watched enough procedural shows to know what a lens looked like, even disguised. But there was nothing. The apartment revealed itself as completely ordinary. Old carpet that had been worn down in patterns, suggesting the movement of people who'd lived here before me. Walls with faint rectangles where previous tenants had hung pictures. Light switches with the accumulated dust of years. A closet that smelled of the building's history, something like mold and time and abandonment. I found nothing that explained the photographs. That night, I didn't pretend to sleep. I didn't pretend to do anything. I sat in the bedroom with the lights on and waited. I'd bought a notebook and a pen. I wrote down the time every 15 minutes. I wrote down what I was thinking, what I was feeling, whether my mind felt present or distant. I was trying to create a record of my own consciousness, as if documentation might anchor me to the present moment, might prevent whatever was happening from continuing to happen. At 11:47 p.m., I wrote, feeling normal, watching door, no sound, apartment quiet. At 12:02 a.m., the page read, still watching, tired but alert. The next entry was at 2:14 a.m., just realized I wrote the previous entry. Don't remember writing it. Hands hurt like I stopped mid-sentence. My hands did hurt. There was a dull ache in my fingers and wrists, the kind you get from gripping something too tightly or writing for too long without stopping. But I hadn't been writing. Or had I? The notebook in front of me had 43 pages covered in my handwriting. 43 pages of observations and descriptions and gradually more incoherent thoughts, all of which I had no memory of writing. I flipped through them, recognizing my own handwriting with a sense of dislocation that felt like falling. 2:14 a.m., just realized I wrote the previous entry 2:16 a.m. This is impossible. I was awake. I was watching. I didn't 2:18 a.m. sleep. Did I sleep? No, I didn't. I remember sitting. I remember the light on the wall. I remember looking at the door. I remember watching my hands 2:23 a.m. They're shaking. Why are they shaking? I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not. The entries continued, becoming more fragmented, more desperate. Timestamps that seemed to correspond to what should have been 40 minutes of time, but which I'd experienced as nothing, as zero, as a gap in the world. And then at the bottom of the last page, a single sentence in handwriting that wasn't mine. She knows we're here now. I dropped the notebook. It fell open on the carpet. I stood up too quickly, and the room shifted. My legs felt strange, unreliable. The air in the bedroom seemed thicker than it had been, denser somehow, as if the space itself was contracting. The lights were still on, all of them. I'd made sure of that. But the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, pooling in corners that shouldn't have contained shadows. The space under the bed, the area behind the door, the far corner of the closet. These places had developed a quality of profound darkness, the kind that light didn't seem to touch. I backed out of the bedroom and closed the door. In the hallway I stood very still and tried to think clearly. The apartment was small. A bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, a living room connected by a narrow hallway. There was nowhere to run that wasn't still within these walls. There was nowhere to hide. There was nowhere to go. I checked my phone. 2:47 a.m. According to my last conscious memory, it had been 11:47 p.m. The night had devoured 3 hours and left them behind like hollowed-out bones. I called someone, an old friend. Morgan, I didn't think about it. I just dialed before my mind could talk me out of it. Morgan answered on the fourth ring, confused and groggy. "It's almost 3 in the morning," they said. "I know. I'm sorry. What did I need? I need to leave. I need to get out of here. Can I come stay with you?" Morgan was already awake now, alert to something in my voice. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, yes, I don't know. Something's wrong with this place. Something's wrong with me. I couldn't explain. I couldn't explain the photographs or the lost time or the handwriting that wasn't my own. I just need to not be here." There was a pause. Then Morgan said, "Pack a bag. I'll send you an Uber. 20 minutes. I hung up and moved toward the bedroom to get clothes, then stopped. I couldn't go into the bedroom. The thought of crossing that threshold, of collecting my things from a space where that darkness had pooled in corners, was impossible. Instead, I grabbed my coat and my keys and my phone and walked directly to the door. That's when I noticed the mirror. There was a small mirror hanging in the hallway. I'd passed it dozens of times since moving in, usually just catching a glimpse of myself without really seeing. But now I stopped in front of it. The reflection that looked back at me was wrong. It wasn't drastically wrong. The face was mine. The dark hair was mine. The shape of the shoulders was mine. But there was something about the quality of presence in the mirror that didn't match what I felt in my body. The reflection seemed more solid than I felt, more present, more here. Its eyes held an awareness that I didn't recognize, a depth of knowledge that I didn't possess. And as I watched, unable to look away, unable to move, the reflection's lips moved. It didn't speak. There was no sound. But I could read the shape of the words, the movement of the mouth. It was saying something in my own voice, something articulate and clear, something that I understood immediately but couldn't quite process. "We've been looking for you such a long time." I ran. I grabbed my keys and my phone and I ran out of that apartment. I didn't look back. I didn't check the door behind me. I took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. Moving down through the building's narrow stairwell, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The Uber was already outside when I reached the street. I got in the back seat, and Morgan's address was already in the navigation. The driver looked at me once in the rearview mirror, concerned, assessing whether I was a threat, and then looked away. I sat with my hands clenched on my thighs and tried to breathe. The apartment disappeared behind us, but the feeling didn't. That sense of presence that had filled those rooms, that sense of being observed, documented, known, it remained with me even as the car moved through the sleeping streets of the city, even as the distance between me and that place increased. Even now, hours later, sitting in Morgan's guest room as dawn breaks over the street outside, I can feel it, that awareness, that presence, the knowledge that something was looking for me, and that whatever it was, it had finally found what it was searching for. And I'm not sure anymore whether it's still back in that apartment or whether it came with me when I left. I'm not sure if leaving made any difference at all. Morgan's guest room had pale yellow walls and a window that faced east. The morning light came in gradually, turning the space from gray to amber to a warm, almost apologetic gold. I lay on top of the comforter without moving, watching the quality of the light shift, and knowing that I couldn't stay here forever, that eventually I would have to go back. Not to the apartment. I didn't know if I could ever go back to the apartment, but back to something. Back to work. Back to the small machinery of living that I'd abandoned the moment I saw my reflection move with intentions that weren't mine. Around 8 o'clock, Morgan knocked softly and entered with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at me with a particular expression of someone who wants to help but doesn't know how. We hadn't talked much the night before. When she picked me up, I'd been unable to explain anything coherently. I just sat in her car with my hand shaking and my mouth unable to form the words that would make any of this make sense. How do you tell someone that you saw yourself in a mirror and it wasn't you? How do you explain that you've lost hours of your own life to something you can't see or name? How are you feeling? Morgan asked. She sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance. Like I'm losing my mind, I said. It was the most honest thing I'd said in days. Morgan considered this. Okay, so either you are or you're not. And if you're not, then something else is happening. And if you are, then we'll figure that out too. But you're safe here. That's what matters right now. I didn't feel safe. Safety wasn't something I could feel anymore. But I nodded because it was what she needed me to do, and because I was too tired to argue. The coffee was good. Real a small anchor to the ordinary world. I drank it slowly and tried to convince myself that the events of the previous night could be recontextualized as a stress response. Sleep deprivation, something neurological, a break from reality that could be repaired with time and distance and professional help. These thoughts felt thin and unconvincing, but I held on to them anyway. Later that morning, after Morgan left for work, I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. I explained that there was a mold issue, I didn't have the language for the truth, and he didn't ask for details. He seemed almost relieved. He said he'd handle the rest. He said I could leave my deposit and he'd arrange for a removal service to handle my things. I felt a small jolt of something at that. The idea of strangers moving through those rooms touching my belongings in spaces that had held something else, something aware. But I pushed it aside. It was already done. The apartment was already gone from me. I spent the next week at Morgan's place. The first few days were the strangest. My body operated in a kind of dissociative haze. I showered. I ate. I walked to the corner store with Morgan and bought groceries. I sat on her couch and watched television without absorbing any of it. All the while, my mind was somewhere else. It was back in that apartment, moving through the hallway, opening drawers, standing in front of that mirror. Reconstructing, searching for the moment where the boundary had been crossed, where something from outside had found a way in. I remembered the photographs. That was the thing that kept cycling through my thoughts. The photographs that had been taken from inside my apartment, of rooms I had entered only as myself. Someone, something, had been documenting my life in my own space. Not breaking in, not stealing, just recording, bearing witness, collecting evidence of my existence. The photographs were still there. I'd left them on the kitchen counter when I ran. The thought of them sitting in that apartment, undisturbed, waiting, made something in my chest tighten. On the 10th day, I went to see a therapist. Her office was in a medical building downtown, clean and professional and designed to be comforting. Dr. Reeves was older, with careful eyes and a way of listening that felt genuinely attentive. I sat across from her and tried to describe what had happened. I told her about the lost time, about the photographs. I didn't tell her about the handwriting or the mirror. I wasn't stupid enough to do that. I described the events in clinical terms: dissociation, possible fugue states, intrusive thoughts. She asked about my sleep schedule, my stress levels, my family history of mental illness. She prescribed something to help me sleep and something else to manage anxiety. She suggested I take some time away from work. She said these things happen. She said they were treatable. I wanted to believe her. I tried very hard to believe her. But I knew what I'd seen. By the 3rd week, I was able to return to work. The world had reestablished itself around me with almost embarrassing ease. My absence had been briefly noted and then forgotten. My desk was exactly as I'd left it. My projects had been distributed among other people. No one had noticed that I'd been gone. Life had continued without me. That was somehow the most unsettling thing of all. Morgan offered to let me stay longer, but I knew I couldn't. I was grateful, but I also felt the weight of my displacement in her home. I began looking for a new apartment. I avoided the neighborhood where the old one had been. I looked in different parts of the city, places without history attached to them. New buildings, renovated spaces, anywhere that felt like it had been cleared of the past. I found a place on a busy street with good light and no basement and walls that had been painted so many times they were smooth and neutral. The landlord seemed young and uninterested. The previous tenant had left no impression. I moved in on a Thursday afternoon with boxes that contained most of what I'd salvaged from my old life. Some clothes, some books, the things Morgan had boxed up for me. It was enough. For the first month, I was hyper-alert. I listened for sounds in the walls. I checked the locks repeatedly before bed. I avoided mirrors except when I absolutely had to use them, and even then I didn't look closely. I kept the lights on when I was home, but nothing happened. The apartment remained exactly what it appeared to be, a small, ordinary space where an ordinary person lived an ordinary life. Time passed. The edges of what had happened began to soften. I stopped waking up in a state of panic. I stopped seeing my own face in moments of rest. I returned to the rhythm of my work. I went to therapy once a week and made progress that felt both genuine and performative. Dr. Reeves seemed satisfied with my progress. The medication was helping. The intrusive thoughts were less frequent. The dissociative episodes had stopped. I was healing, or at least I was becoming someone who could perform healing convincingly enough that I believed it myself. It was during this period of careful normalcy that I noticed the photograph. It was on my kitchen counter. I found it one morning when I was making coffee. Just one. Not a series. Not a documentation of rooms and spaces. Just a single, ordinary photograph of myself sitting on the couch in my new apartment. I was asleep. My head was tilted back against the cushion. My left arm was hanging over the side. The photograph was taken from the doorway, at a distance that suggested someone standing in that space, looking in. I dropped the coffee mug. It shattered across the floor. I stared at the photograph without picking it up, trying to understand its geometry. I knew that couch. It was in my living room. I was certain I'd been alone when I fell asleep. I was certain of that. Except I wasn't. I couldn't be. Not anymore. I called Morgan immediately. She came over and saw the photograph, and her face did something complicated that I didn't want to interpret. She asked if I was sure I'd been alone. I said yes. She asked if it was possible I'd forgotten. I said no. She suggested that maybe I'd taken it myself in some kind of fugue state and just didn't remember. The word fugue hung in the air between us like something with teeth. I took the photograph to Dr. Reeves at my next session. She examined it carefully. She asked if it was possible someone had taken it consensually, and I'd simply forgotten. She asked if I was sleeping well on my medication. She asked if I'd been experiencing any gaps in time or any intrusive thoughts. Her questions were gentle, but underneath them was a current of concern that I recognized. She was beginning to wonder if the treatment was working. She was beginning to consider other possibilities, other diagnoses, ones with longer treatment plans and grimmer prognosis. I didn't bring her another photograph. But they kept appearing, not frequently, not so often that it would be obvious or dramatic, just intermittently. One on the kitchen counter, one on my nightstand. One slipped under my door, always of me in my apartment, always taken from a vantage point that suggested someone standing in my space, documenting my mundane life with patient, meticulous attention, always from angles that I couldn't have achieved myself. I stopped talking about them. I stopped mentioning the lost time or the sense of presence that had returned, faint but persistent, like a smell that lingered in a room after someone had left. I stopped describing the small moments when I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, or when I would wake at night with a certain knowledge that I had not been alone during my sleep. I continued to see Dr. Reeves. I continued to take my medication. I continued to tell her that I was fine, that the episodes had stopped, that I was sleeping well and eating well and adjusting to my new space. She seemed relieved. She said we might be able to reduce my dosage. She said it was common for people to experience a period of adjustment after a traumatic event. She said most people recovered fully. Most people. I've been in this apartment for 7 months now. The photographs have become less frequent, but they haven't stopped. Some have changed. They're not just of me sleeping anymore. There are images of me at work, taken through the office windows. Images of me walking down the street, taken from across the street, from behind, from angles that would require someone to be waiting for me, following me, knowing my roots. I've stopped trying to explain them. I've stopped trying to make sense of them. I've incorporated them into the landscape of my life the way you incorporate a persistent ache or a recurring dream. They're part of the furniture of my existence now. But something changed last week. I found a photograph that wasn't of me. It was taken in my bedroom, facing toward the wall opposite my bed. The angle was the same as all the others. From the doorway, from the vantage point of someone standing at the threshold. But in this image, there was another figure. It was standing at the foot of my bed, facing away from the camera, looking down at me as I slept. The figure was indistinct, more of an absence than a presence, a kind of shadow that had taken almost human form. But it was there. Documented, made real by the camera's eye. And beneath the photograph, in handwriting that was not my own, but was becoming increasingly familiar, someone had written, "We've been so patient. We're almost finished looking. I'm sitting in my living room now. It's late. The lights are all on. I've been staring at this sentence for 3 hours, trying to understand what it means, trying to understand what it means to finish looking. My coffee has gone cold beside me. The apartment is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, and somewhere in that silence I can feel the awareness again, that sense of being observed, that sense of a presence that exists in the spaces between moments, in the gaps in my own perception, in the rooms that I move through without seeing. I think I understand now what that reflection was trying to tell me all those months ago. It wasn't looking for me. It was looking for itself, and I was the only one who could help it find its way back.